So do I share my screen? All right, thank you everybody for being here this morning for you, this evening for me, and thanks for having me at your symposium. I'd like to share with you some of the background that goes into the framework that I recently published on human AI interaction. It's primarily based on my theory of interactive media effects that I've written about before. But with particular focus on artificial intelligence and kind of the tension between human agency and machine agency. So I'd like to talk today, first of all, about human agency and how interactive media kind of gave rise to human agency or kind of helped us realize our human agency, and then move on to the psychology of machine agency and kind of draw out the tension between the two agencies before applying that agency tension to the domain of AI or artificial intelligence. And then I will conclude by talking about using the theory of interactive media effects to conceptualize human AI interaction and how we can potentially develop this theoretical framework further. So at the turn of the century, one of the big things that happened is the rise of interactive media, where it signaled a fundamental shift in communication, such that the transmission models of communication that we knew for 50 years before the year 2000 were pretty much kind of turned on their head by making the receivers into sources. So in essence, what happened with interactive media is that the receivers began to interact with media in a way confusing them with sources of communication. Historically, source was distinct from receiver, but then interactive media made receivers kind of sources. And so this kind of gave rise to all kinds of dissemination activity by receivers. They became disseminators of information, not only kind of in terms of feedback to the sender, but also in terms of sharing the information to their networks, as we see with social media. Anybody and everybody can become broadcasters, just like the anchor persons on television. So receivers became creators of content and became broadcasters and disseminators of that content. And of course, as we know, that resulted in all kinds of fake content. Lately, that's been in this past decade, this has kind of exploded into a big phenomenon where receivers, because of the agency they have, that they are able to actually become sources of information, are able to spread all kinds of misinformation. And around the turn of, around the middle part of the last decade, during the 2016 election, it kind of turned the tide, if you will. This is a famous graph from BuzzFeed, which was published in November 2016, which showed for the first time that fake news surpassed mainstream news in terms of engagements, in terms of the number of shares and reactions and comments that they got on Facebook. And this was the first time that, collectively, all of us, especially in academia, kind of took note of fake news as no longer a fringe phenomenon, but in fact, a serious competitor to mainstream news. And for me, this kind of signaled interactivity as a source feature, something that I've written about for several years now, where we've been talking about conceptualizing interactivity as the ability of the technology for users, individual users, to become sources of communication and to kind of customize their information environment such that it makes them get more involved and engaged with the content, and that has psychological outcomes, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And this is really the heart of the sense of agency that we talk about. It's the ability to be the source of communication. It's the degree to which one becomes a relevant actor, not just a passive receiver of information like it used to be with traditional mass communication. And it's also the extent to which one can assert one's influence in the online media discourse. And that's really what is made possible in this world of social media, where with a simple text field and a publish button, that's really what it is, and often a finite bandwidth, like in Twitter you have certain character limits, that itself can be very empowering and can lead to positive attitudes toward the platform. Studies have shown that this ability of these social media to give people a chance to have their say can be profoundly consequential in terms of expressing themselves. This is the importance of self-expression that source interactivity kind of brings. And of course, the two big social media, Facebook and Twitter, are great examples of doing this with their affordances. They have, in the form of a simple status update field, they can actually compose new text, or in the case of Twitter, they can compose a new tweet. And that ability to compose and create content, as it turns out, is psychologically very consequential. The mechanism of source interactivity essentially is the idea that users have a sense of identity, they can express their identity, they have a sense of control, and these two come together when they are able to opine on social media and engage on Facebook or Twitter and be able to kind of have their say. And our studies over the years have shown that this sense of identity and sense of control can be quite powerful. And so this notion of self-agency or human agency, which primarily I think caused by social media, but more fundamentally the interactivity allowed by social media, this self as source, the idea that you and I can be sources of information, where previously it was a privilege of just a few elites in the media, like journalists and editors. They had pulpit from which to act as sources. Now all of us can be sources of information. This kind of led me to propose the agency model of customization back in 2008, which basically argued that different affordances of modern interactive media, like interactivity, modality, and navigability, allow each one of us to express ourselves and our identity and be able to control the way we interact online. And also, it makes us get highly involved in the content. And that's what we found in study after study, all of which can be profoundly consequential in terms of giving us a sense of agency. And that's really what the rise of sense of agency is all about. But when you think about all of this, there's a but to this. And the but is there's a lot of effort involved, right? And customization is a lot of work. We have to create content. We have to actually compose content. We have to create our environment. But we know from social psychology that we are creatures of convenience. We are cognitive misers. We outsource tasks as much as possible. So we'd rather not have to do all this work to customize our media environment. Instead, wouldn't it be nice if the system did all that tailoring for us? Wouldn't it be more convenient if systems knew exactly what we wanted and gave it to us in a way that was highly, personalized for us? And that's really what the technology of AI has brought in, is personalization. AI has pretty much learned our needs, has learned our behaviors, our behavioral patterns. And that's why when you go to Google, for example, Google knows exactly what you're going to type next. It almost kind of autofills when you're beginning to type something. Or when you go to Netflix, it can suggest movies for you, right? Which movies would be something that you'd enjoy. And it does so because it keeps track of your prior viewing or your prior searching behaviors. And these kinds of technologies have now become so common in our mainstream media that the media do all the work in terms of tailoring content for you rather than you having to customize necessarily. And so there's this kind of dichotomy that gets created at the end of the day between customization and personalization. Customization that I talked about earlier, having to do with you expressing your agency, is where you tailor the content for yourself. You even create the content sometimes to tailor it to your liking. Personalization is the opposite, where the system kind of tailors content for you. And so this distinction is consequential from the point of view of the agency model that I just talked about, because when you think about it, agency model would predict that customization, where you get to tailor rather than the system, tailoring for you, will give rise to more agency. You'll feel more in control. And that's what is the key for positive attitudes toward the content, positive attitudes toward the interface. And so we tested this about 10 years ago with a study that we used Google News website, where, in one condition, we would give people a Google News website without kind of any manipulation. And people were allowed to kind of customize their news preferences, and they could create whatever they wanted. In another condition, they would be personalized. So in other words, it was something that was personalized based on their prior viewing or prior reading. So we created a situation in an experiment where there was a customization menu where users would either customize themselves, or they would just come and browse on Google. The next day when they came back to the study, they would find stories that were very related to the kinds of stories that they read the previous day. So on the one hand, we let them customize, but on the other hand, we did not let them customize, but we personalized for them on the second day that they came to the lab. And we found that in general, people preferred customization over personalization. That is, they loved the fact that they could customize and they could control over the fact that the system tailored it for them. But this was true only for so-called power users. Power users are people who are technologically savvy. They make good use of the features of technology. They're comfortable with technology. They're the opinion leaders. They're the people that their friends go to if they have a technological problem. But for non-power users, we found the exact opposite pattern. We found that for non-power users, people who are not technologically savvy, they prefer that the system do the tailoring for them rather than they take the effort to kind of customize the content. So this is, a kind of a transverse interaction finding, and you can see both of them are different from control in a way. And so in general, we found that power users like to take control into their own hands, and non-power users would be more comfortable letting the system do the tailoring for them. So why do you think this happens? I don't know if this is interactive enough forum, if you're able to respond, but let me see if you can respond. What do you think are some reasons why power users, people who are technologically savvy, would prefer customization, whereas non-power users would prefer the system tailoring it for them?
Okay, the power users would like to be in control, and they know what to happen when they make some modifications. So there's no sort of uncertainty involved with their actions, so they can predict the consequence. So they are more comfortable doing things on their own, whereas the low power users, the novice users, they don't know what to do with it. And also the level of involvement with the technology, so they are not comfortable with making changes. So they would like to exercise the minimum amount of effort, and when things are given, then that's good enough.
Yeah. So that's one factor, the sense of control among power users. And for non-power users, it's more like, they don't want to deal with it. It's more convenient if the system does it for them, right? So these were some things that we kind of, thought about. But there's another reason that came up, and this is, keep in mind the study was done about 12 years ago. At that time, we were just beginning to think about issues of privacy. It's not like we were as well informed about online privacy as we were now. Back in the day, there was all kind of scaremongering going on about privacy. So one of the fundamental points that I wanted to try to make about this concern for privacy that kind of emerged was this idea that there was this broad kind of wariness about tracking, online tracking, So much so that people, would rather that the systems don't collect any information about you. And that was around the turn of the decade, around 2010, that was kind of the general sentiment. The vast majority did not want websites or any systems tracking them. In fact, they were very surprised to find that Google personalizes, for example. Many people are unaware. The majority of people are unaware that Google search results are personalized. It's based partly on what you searched before. And you can see over 50% of the people are unhappy about it, that they don't like the fact that Google does that. And so this began to emerge about 10, 12 years ago. This began to emerge as a serious concern. Privacy and individual rights to privacy became a concern. So we did a follow-up experiment with that same customization, personalization study with some very simple manipulation. Like in the conditions, we basically said that Google News website will not use your information, will not share your information. So that was like the high privacy condition. But on the other, for other half of the participants, we told them it may use your browsing information to provide services that you've requested. It may share aggregated non-personal information with third parties. So very subtle, very simple kind of manipulation of privacy. So on the left-hand side, what you see is high privacy, guaranteeing that it won't share. On the right-hand side, you see kind of lesser privacy where it might share. And we found in this study, which is kind of the follow-up to our earlier study, that the transverse interaction pattern that we found, where people who are power users, higher the power usage, greater the preference for customization. And then if you're non-power users, you like personalization. That transverse interaction happened only in the condition of low privacy. That is, assuming that the systems will trade your information or will collect your information. When it came to high privacy, you can see that even power users preferred personalization as much as non-power users. And so, with high privacy, power users are okay with personalization, with the system tailoring, but power users tend to assume low privacy as the default. And that is why you're seeing the kind of pattern that I showed you in the other study. And we kind of probed with some of the other variables too, like control and convenience. And we found that when you give high privacy, the higher the power usage, for both customization and personalization, the more the power usage, the more the perceived control, and the greater the perceived, convenience. And this is true as long as the privacy is assured. But when it is not, when the privacy is low, that's when you find this transverse interaction, such that as power usage goes up, you perceive more control and convenience only for customization. But for personalization, as power usage goes up, your perceived control and convenience kind of comes down. So this really is an indication of how users are kind of trying to assert their agency. And of course, power users are the ones who kind of know how to do this and how to kind of realize agency, how to use technology to realize agency, using the affordances of these customization technologies to kind of assert the identity and control. And so the fact that they prefer customization over personalization and want to take privacy into their own hands because they assume low privacy shows that they want to attain, autonomy. And so we've done several studies in the past. In fact, we did one in Korea when I was there in Sungkyunkwan University with tailored or targeted ads, where if you're walking around on the street, you'll get like a little coupon in your mobile phone based on your location. And this is what we call location-based advertising, where, it's a very big interest in the industry. There are a lot of industry data that show that consumers prefer tailored ads that are personalized to their interests. And so we had a situation where we created a simulation of a street in Seoul where, people are walking. It was a VR environment. And then on a mobile phone, they would get ads for like a Starbucks or, different kinds of merchants in the area. And we generally found that when it is tailored and when it is locationally congruent, that it's something in the nearby area, and of course, when they have high product involvement, people do love, they do have a very good positive attitude toward the location-based ads. They intend to use the services provided the intrusiveness is low. So this needs to be assured. So if, for example, you give them that coupon without their knowledge, they get alarmed. And so as long as you're able to provide these services, as long as they're able to provide personalized services without making them feel like they're being intruded upon, then you get positive attitudes. And so, this is something that is a well-known trope online, where Google's always watching you and all the mobile phone apps are kind of tracking every one of your movements and what you do online. And so there have been several strategies over the last few years to kind of combat, privacy concerns. So there's been this evolution of what we call overt personalization, which is much more pull-based. You kind of pull the ad when you need it. So if you're walking on the street, the app will tell you, looks like you're walking on, College Avenue. Would you like some coupons for businesses in this area? And only if you say yes, it'll give you the ads. But it won't just, shove an ad for Starbucks just because you're in front of Starbucks. That would be called covert personalization, which is kind of proactive. It automatically, proactively does that. But overt personalization is less proactive. It's more overt. There's greater transparency about how the user data is utilized in the process of personalization. And the idea is to, make sure that people know that there's not data being collected and stored, that it is ephemeral, that it kind of is only on the moment that they get that service. So it's kind of reactive. It's not so proactive on the part of the technology. And of course, transparency is a very important aspect as well. And transparency of information relates to collection, storage, how the service uses your data, and also how it removes the data. And so information transparency is a very big aspect of pretty much all our mobile media interactions, where good apps usually are much more visible, and they tell you kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So this can combat this kind of paradox that we see, where on the one hand, we like the systems to tailor things for us, but on the other hand, we love our privacy. So we are very possessive of our privacy. And so we've done studies where we've tested these different mechanisms of overt personalization and information transparency. And in general, we find that information transparency builds more trust. Overt personalization gives people a sense of control. And both of them kind of reduce privacy concern and increase user engagement with the products and services that are offered. So this is just to give you a quick snapshot of how this tension between machine agency and human agency kind of can come about with personalization, and how we can try to solve that by giving more agency to the user, even as machines kind of keep increasing their agency. I mean, you can, if you go through the history of technology, trace the history of technology in terms of the amount of human agency that's involved. If you go back to the older technologies like the hammer, the entire agency was in the hands of the human, and the human had to trigger the technology. But now increasingly you see apps telling us what to do, right? So we have all kinds of devices. We've come a long way from the hammer, where we dictated the action, to smartwatches, which tells you to get up and start moving. How many of you have smartwatches that tell you you've been sitting too long, get up and start moving, right? That shows the level of agency difference, between what used to be the case with traditional technologies and modern technologies. And so this is where I got the idea of collaboration. The idea that we are having to now endlessly collaborate with technology, And one of the, I think, the best examples of very happy collaboration, there are, of course, lots of good examples of unhappy collaboration, but happy collaboration is the car navigator, right? Most of us use car navigators now to the point where we forget which part of town we are in. We don't even know if you're going north or south, but we trust the technology so much now that we don't even use maps anymore. It's a very happy coexistence, right? This is an example of resolving the tension between machine agency and human agency, where we have come to a place where we trust the machine to a point where we give up some of our innate curiosity or innate intellectual curiosity to know where we are, and let the navigator take control, let the machine take control. And we do this even in some games, and we kind of let it kind of navigate the world for us. And so all of this kind of gives rise to this notion of agency negotiation, where the humans perceive the intelligent technology as agents. And in general, we kind of co-construct together, the reality. So the idea is technologies that afford human agency without kind of the negative consequences of privacy intrusion can help us, have a very happy, collaboration, happy communication. And so this has spawned a whole series of apps. Some of them are, of course, not in the market right now, but there were apps like Whisper, which is basically you would be able to anonymously have a conversation in your networks without, revealing who you are, or EKIAC, which is a social networking site, which is location-based social networking site, where you don't have to reveal your identity, but still you get to share things around in your area. Snapchat, of course, is a well-known example where you say some things and it disappears after a few seconds, right? So that's the biggest selling point of Snapchat, is ephemerality. That's kind of the affordance of Snapchat, where it comes and it goes. So you're not accountable. So a lot of my undergrad students, they were very worried about Facebook and other social networking sites where they would post all these pictures of them partying and drinking. And then when it came time for them to be on the job market, they were worried that somebody could go in and find out all the stuff that they've been doing. But so that's why Snapchat became very popular with undergrads and with teenagers, because it offered one thing that they all loved, which is the absence of accountability, absence of recordability, or in other words, ephemerality. And so this is an example of limiting machine agency, even though it gives you a lot of agency. And so Facebook wanted to actually buy Snapchat. It was a huge multi-billion-dollar offer, which Snapchat turned down. But in general, limiting machine agency is actually a very lucrative business, as it turns out. It's big business, how machine agency can be limited. But the reason is we do want machine agency. It's not like we want to get rid of it, right? There are lots of good advantages of machine agency. Machine agency enhance human agencies. It enables us to make better decisions. It offers us convenience. It frees us, of cognitive and physical resources. It helps us customize, curate, and create content like we talked about. It, provides, more control over the interaction. Subversive apps like EKIAC, for example, or Snapchat even, they help us overcome surveillance. And then there are all kinds of smart media that help us improve communication skills. We have chess games that augment human abilities. We have robots that provide companionship. We had a paper this year at CHAII about how Alexa can help coach us for, overcoming, social skill deficits. So there are lots of advantages to machine agencies in terms of enhancing the human agency. But we also have to recognize that at the same time, they pose a threat to human agency. Of course, the larger media discourse is that, there's job loss due to automation. Machines have more control. A human is left out of the loop, like you saw in that ACLU video. The boundaries between systems are very fuzzy. You don't know whether the healthcare system is talking to the pizza delivery system. And so you feel like there's a general loss of privacy. And so there are different kinds of threats that are posed. And often security concerns are a big issue. And interoperability among systems can create needless complexity or complexity that you cannot even understand. And these days we know that bots online can fool us into spreading fake news by pretending that they are real users. So ultimately, and there's been a lot of books written about it by people like Nicholas Carr and so forth, smart media actually lead to dumb users, that they lower our interpersonal skills, they lower our self-efficacy, our intelligence. And so the general idea that, this Internet of Things can kind of take care of our lives so that we can amuse ourselves to death and we can just watch Netflix. Speaking of which, some of you might have seen this documentary or docudrama, if you will, called Social Dilemma, which came out recently on Netflix, where basically it shows the dilemma, this dilemma that I'm talking about. On the one hand, we need social media, we cannot live without them, but we also cannot live with them because they expose too much of our privacy and so forth. So there have been many ways in which we can combat that, like I talked about earlier. Overt personalization and information transparency are good ways to deploy machines to enhance human agency, greater visibility of how our input can change the way it collects data. These have been some things that we've talked about in the computing community. There's, of course, all kinds of alerts and warnings that you can have, where you can in fact, have an alert that says just because something has 2,000 likes doesn't mean these likes are all from real people. You can have an alert that says that. Like Twitter, for example, has alerts now about President Trump's tweets, for example, right? Like that, you can have alerts. You can have machines alerting you to the potential of, for example, fake content or manufactured content or bots. So there are lots of, fake news being spread by bots. And so the idea is to kind of figure out ways to use machines to kind of track this machine agency and to kind of hold this under control. And one of the projects that we've been doing at Penn State is leveraging machine learning to kind of overcome the human cognitive deficits in detecting fake news, because there's so much fake news around us that it's very hard for humans to kind of do this on a individual basis. So we have been working on algorithms with our colleagues at Information Science and Technology. And so Professor Dongwon Lee, who I believe gave a talk to you guys not too long ago, he and I have been awarded an NSF grant a few years ago to kind of train machines to kind of detect fake news. And through explication of fake news, where we come up with different characteristics of messages, structures, networks, and sources, we try to come up with very granular machine learning level features that can help us detect fake news. So in general, just to kind of summarize some of these ideas, media are no longer mere channels. They are increasingly intelligent, and AI is an integral part of media-mediated communication. For CMC, for computer-mediated communication, AI will profoundly redefine human communication, like how Gmail auto-completes whatever message you send out, or Google translates what you want to say. And it sometimes can raise questions about human senders' intentionality, authenticity, and credibility, because if you wish somebody on their birthday because Facebook prompted you to wish them on their birthday, that doesn't seem all that authentic, because you're kind of helped along by machine. So those kinds of questions are raised when you depend on machine agency. For HCI, for human-computer interaction, where we are talking about interacting directly with a machine, AI becomes the source, much like computers were the source. Back in the 1990s, when Unju and I were working with our advisor, Cliff Nass, we were talking about people behaving socially with computers and how odd that seemed. But now, that's not so odd. Social responses to computers is not an oddity because they're intelligent. They are as intelligent, or if not more intelligent than humans. And so when we think about social responses to AI interfaces, especially because most of them are anthropomorphic. When you think about robots, think about Alexa, think about smart speakers, they're all very anthropomorphic. And so in general, social responses is now kind of the logical way to respond to these technologies. And so with AI mediation, with AI being part of our media, there's going to be no such thing as medium agnostic content, because content is profoundly shaped by the characteristics of the AI, driving that medium or media interface. And then there's going to be no such thing as content agnostic medium any longer, because the manner in which the AI-driven affordances kind of manifest themselves is shaped by the content that is typically experienced within the medium. So the kind of content that you see coming out of Alexa is different from the kind of content that you'll see from Google search. And so the reason their content is different is because of the kind of AI that is embedded in them. And so we cannot really study technology independent of content, and the core stimuli of interest are kind of the affordances of AI or AI media. And so this is really where my article that was published recently kind of takes off and talks about how interacting with AI has kind of both a symbolic aspect and a kind of an enabling or inactive aspect. So AI has kind of become a symbol by itself. And so when you say something is driven by AI, or your chess partner is AI, or you're playing a game with an AI, or there's AI in the writing of this journalistic story that you're seeing published in a news website, what it does, it triggers a kind of a cognitive shortcut in our head called the machine heuristic. And the machine heuristic is this idea that machines are rule governed, they're precise, they're accurate, they're objective, they're neutral, they're infallible, they do not gossip with our information. So these are some things that we associate with machines, where it kind of is something that is ingrained in us. And on the other hand, we also have some negative connotations with machines. Machines are mechanistic, they're unemotional, they're cold, they're unyielding, they're transactional, they can be hacked. So these are, again, some stereotypes that we have about machines that we carry around in our head. And so when you say AI, these stereotypes can get triggered. And so the reality is machines are, fallible. They can be manipulated, and they can be hacked, right? So even though we might think that AI is infallible, and the AI is going to be accurate and superior, the reality is machines increasingly can be vulnerable. And so, scholars have talked about how users tend to attribute decisions made by algorithm to their efficiency and objectivity, which render kind of them fit for mechanical tasks, but kind of unfit for human tasks. So the positive machine heuristic applies for kind of mechanical tasks, and the negative machine heuristic applies for more kind of subjective judgments. And so, different people have different stances, of course, but generally speaking, you have these, kind of stereotypes associated with AI for certain roles in society and not for other roles and so forth. And so the user stance toward AI is a very big aspect of human AI interaction. As it turns out, there's a history of research by Mosier et al. On this concept of automation bias. And this started with autopilots in human factors engineering, in industrial engineering, which long noticed, back in the day, they talked about how people, especially pilots, tend to overtrust autopilot systems. They tend to overtrust machines and underestimate humans to perform the same tasks. And this kind of reduces vigilance. It kind of makes people outsource the tasks to machines. And this kind of bias is known in the literature as kind of automation bias. And in fact, in a way, some of the recent, disasters or mishaps with the planes can be attributed to automation bias, like the spectacular Boeing 737 MAX crashes that we saw in the last couple of years with the Ethiopian Airlines and Indonesian Airlines. where basically the idea that the autopilot or the auto sensors that were there to kind of stabilize the aircraft were so complex that the regular pilots were trained on an iPad for less than an hour to how to take care of it. And as a result, most pilots don't know how to kind of cope with it, especially in a kind of a time-sensitive situation like that. And so I blame these crashes on automation bias and on our kind of stereotype that we have about machines, or our kind of stance that we have. So prior experience with AI can play a big role in kind of dictating whether we should trust AI blindly, like autopilots, or we have another phenomenon that is emerging now called algorithm aversion, where people have had a bad experience. Get Worse and others have talked about this, where they for example, they get a bad movie recommendation on Netflix, or TripAdvisor gives them a bad recommendation on a hotel, and suddenly they lose trust in the algorithm, and they tend to prefer human judgments over algorithmic decisions, even though that is not the optimal solution. And so this is the opposite stance, so to speak. So both kinds of stances kind of play a role. And in general, the idea that we have these notions in our head about how AI works under the hood. This is called folk theories. And so folk theories are about how AI must be making the decisions or getting to the decisions. And so there have been several studies about how belief in folk theories kind of dictate user reactions, including kind of resignation, like I cannot do much about it, this is how the AI works. And so people have all this kind of imagined algorithms in their head. This is sometimes called algorithmic imaginary, where social media users hold these mental constructions about how algorithms work and the rules underlying their functions based on kind of what your personal experience is with that particular medium. And so these are, again, studied in depth by a lot of our colleagues in computer-mediated communication, especially in the context of social media, where you have theories like, if one of your friends on Facebook is the loudest, you'll see more of their posts. Or if you made friends with them recently, their stories will come up on the top compared to old friends and so forth. So there are all these different theories that people have. And so this is all because there's not enough transparency about exactly how the systems work, and people are always trying to find some ways to control it. And this whole thing arises out of the need for control, the need for human agency. That's how I see this. And in fact, people have talked about this notion of algorithmic anxiety among users of all kinds of media. And there's this one study by Javert et al. About Airbnb hosts who have no idea how Airbnb kind of ranks their properties on, why their properties ranked very high, or why the properties rated at a certain price level. And so, they did several studies to kind of look at how Airbnb hosts kind of cope with it, or how they even make sense of this. And so, to what extent the listing price or instant booking or the number of reviews could make a difference, or cancellations could make a difference, quality of the reviews could make a difference. So there's so many factors that could play a role in how much control they perceive over their property's listing and how certain they are. And so, but ultimately they have to go with this kind of vague notion of what's in their head, because Airbnb is not going to give them their algorithm. And so they come up with their own coping strategies. Some hosts just trust in the fairness of the system. A lot of them do reverse engineering. They put in one price and see what happens, how many people they get. They also have a community with other Airbnb hosts, and they do comparisons with them. And so they kind of do various adjustments to see if they can figure out how to deal with this algorithm. And so this has become a big issue in the human-computer interaction community. And some people have called for more transparency, or for better kind of algorithmic experience, or AX as it's called. So how the algorithm profiles you, how it manages your profile, how much user control it gives you, how much it remembers about you, how much awareness you have. These are all different aspects of algorithmic experience, or AX, that have been proposed in that community, just to give users much more agency in a system, or in a kind of suite of systems that seem to kind of assert agency by machines. And so the move right now in the field is to see AI as not as this kind of omnipotent actor, but rather as a mutual actor that can negotiate agency, where it can trade off control with the user, with more human rules and involvement in decision making, and kind of greater collaboration and greater social exchange. Kind of goes back to interpersonal communication in advancing user interest at kind of minimal costs. So the idea is, you want collaboration that is happy, going back to kind of what we talked about, the navigator example. And also, of course, making use of AI's ability to augment us. A lot of us, feel much more augmented. We are able to make better decisions because AI can help us make better decisions, provide us, with ready-to-use information at the right time, in pulling together data that is impossible for humans to do. But the reverse should also be true, is what I think the larger community of human-computer interaction researchers are kind of pushing for, is the AI should constantly check with us and ground truth, look for what is it that we want, while still, balancing the proprietary of the algorithm. Because on the one hand, we want transparency, but on the other hand, if it is too transparent, then it'll be the bad human actors who will kind of hack into the system and misuse the system, right? So we cannot have too much transparency either. Ultimately, Airbnb will lose credibility if all the Airbnb hosts know exactly how the algorithm works and kind of game the system to get their properties to be listed high. And then when the users go to that property, the property is not as good as they thought it would be, or how much they thought they would have to pay for it. And so transparency is not an answer that is very easy to achieve, but it's a balance. So there's this need for mutual augmentation and mutual understanding. So what I did is I leaned on my theory of interactive media effects that was published in the context of traditional interactive media, where we talked about media affordances having kind of two types of effects. One is kind of the cue effect, which is basically triggering these heuristics. That's the more symbolic effect that I was talking about earlier, where if you say that this is coming from a machine, or if there's some metric on the website like bandwagon, it triggers a heuristic or mental shortcut that can create these outcomes that are psychologically important. But then there's also the action effect, where when you engage with an interactive medium, you feel a sense of agency or self-determination, and that creates a more kind of involved engagement, much more systematic processing there, rather than the heuristic processing that you see with the cue route. So I took these two kind of routes, the cue route and the action route, and then applied that to interacting with AI-based media, and talked about how this whole notion of AI as communication sources can have symbolic effects like machine heuristic that I talked about earlier, and how visible attributes of AI like explainable AI or transparency on the interface can have a role in triggering certain kinds of heuristics, including transparency heuristic. Prior experience can play a role because heuristics are based on your prior experience. And so these things can have an effect on our perceptions. And then collaborating, like I just talked about more recently, is about how you can interact and have a social exchange, our algorithmic experience, so to speak, where we achieve kind of a synergy between humans and AI. And that's more kind of the action route that I have in mind. And so when we think about the cue route, AI is a symbol with machine heuristic, and the cues on the media interface kind of suggesting a machine source will trigger that heuristic and shape our judgments about the quality and credibility of the content. And the cue route can, through showing visible attributes of AI, like system transparency, can trigger positive heuristics and lead to better user engagement. And prior experience can serve as a guide on what kind of heuristics are triggered. And we have folk theories to fall back on. So in sum, the cue route of time basically predicts that affordances in AI media can trigger cognitive heuristics by advertising their existence on the interface and by providing interface indicators of their modus operandi, like how it works, like transparency or metrics related to bandwagon and things like that can lead to good user experience. The action route, on the other hand, is based on collaboration, where an AI system kind of invites user input, and there the nature of human-AI interaction will be shaped by the quality of the collaboration, like how social robots and online chatbots and smart speakers, they ask you certain questions, or you ask questions to smart speakers and you have a conversation, right? So this is where interactivity happens, and then agency is much more negotiable because you do have kind of certain costs and benefits there. On the one hand, you have to do a lot more work in terms of searching, choosing settings, making decisions. But on the other hand, you have benefits, like you get more tailored content, more convenience. And so action route can really realize the benefits of human-machine synergy, where you're relating to the technology, you're basically acting in a very tightly coupled fashion, collaborating and augmenting each other. And so this is ultimate kind of the holy grail, so to speak, of human AI interaction, is achieving this human augmentation, this mutual augmentation, and this trade-offs in agency between humans and machines to kind of achieve a happy medium and shape a positive user experience. So I mapped this out on time in terms of interaction, agency, social exchange, and mutual augmentation as kind of part of the action route. And then the cues and cognitive heuristics being triggered by interface manifestation and algorithmic attributes, giving rise to cognitive heuristics. So you can see both these routes are very parallel to what I proposed in the theory of interactive media effects. So in a way, it kind of maps human AI interaction on the theory of interactive media effects. And that's why we call this the high time model. And you can read more details about this in this article that was published about a year ago in the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication. We in my lab group have already done a fair number of studies using this model. For example, we are presenting in this year's CHAII. We just got an acceptance of a paper where we talk about how AI should talk to users. Should AI seek users' help, or should AI say that they are providing help? In terms of when we're talking about agency negotiation, how should it frame itself as a help seeker, as a help provider? And then how that can have an effect on trust in AI. And we can see that from this data, we find that when AI, as a help seeker, when AI seeks your help, people are, especially power users, feel much more social presence and feel much more positively toward it. And we have another study, this is a dissertation study that is now under review, where we apply both the cue route and the action route of high time to study the effects of AI in the context of content curation, how social media content curation happens. And so whether the curation is done by an AI or by a human or AI human together. And then the action route where the user themselves can choose the keywords that the AI system should use. And so here it's very transparent. We call this interactive transparency, where the users are able to kind of interactively choose how the AI system should make decisions about curating content. And so that again, we tie to user agency and ultimately to kind of trust. So these are some ideas for using a high time model, but ultimately we are interested in kind of how all of this might affect AI-based media, especially credibility of AI-based media, how user experience and trust are kind of key to this persuasion, and what algorithms symbolize is kind of consequential, and collaboration is very important, and negotiation of agency is critical. So in terms of directions for research, I feel like in this area, identifying AI affordances, the salient cues that the AI systems or AI media have that's transmitted on the interface, the collaborative actions that they permit, and the mechanisms by which they affect user experience. The mechanisms of cue route through cognitive heuristics, or the action route through agency and social exchange and mutual augmentation and so forth. That has consequence for user experience of AI, how much we trust in AI, and that can happen both separately as well as interactively. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. I do thank you for listening and for your patience for this rather long presentation.